Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and my guest today is Maggie Hensel-Brown. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Irina. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Well, I must tell you, until I stumbled on your Instagram account, I never really heard about needle lace. I mean, I guess I've seen it because I've seen it in museum, but I don't think I ever realized the process and how it's actually done. And so when I first saw your things, I had to go and Google and search on YouTube and watch all the tutorials just to get an idea of the process. And it's really very, very slow fashion.
Very much.
What attracted you to needle lace? What was that initial thing that you were like, oh my God, I have to do that?
I would say that it is that slowness and the intense intricacy of it all. I've always been someone who loves very, very intricate, process-based, fine detail, as fine as I could make it. And needle lace just felt like the pinnacle of that of that kind of thing. And I'm not a fashion person. I don't make anything wearable. And to me, needle lace really kind of suited that idea of it's purely decorative. I mean, there's no real reason for lace to exist other than to be beautiful. And so needle lace for me, because it's so slow and so intricate and yeah, just divine and detailed, it really works. As you know, I come from an art background, and so it became this very natural progression to turn those into little artworks, basically.
Well, when I was starting to look into how you do it, what blew my mind was that pieces that I thought were applique of some fabric. I thought at the beginning when I look at it that there is some solid fabric and then you do the lace of the edges. That was my initial impression. And then I start looking at your videos on Instagram, how you make it. And I understood that those shorts that I thought was just a piece of fabric probably take a week to stitch one little knot at the time. Do people underestimate the amount of time that goes into this?
Oh yeah, and also forgivably. I mean, who would think that a piece of lace about this big takes 4 months to make? You know, yeah, definitely. I think that is one of the things. You know, with this particular kind of needle lace, there are needle laces that are made into fabric, so cut work, things like Reticella. So they sometimes do have a bit of pre-existing fabric. That's how I got into it, actually. I did a little bit of Reticella originally. But yeah, the kind of sort of needle lace that I make, which has roots in things like Punto and Aria, Aemilia. It's made out of nothing. There is nothing, and then all you have is a needle and thread. And yeah, so all of the solid areas, all of the sort of plain, yeah, the planes basically, yeah, are made entirely out of tiny little stitches. So it is, I think people do often assume that, yeah, there's some kind of quicker route to get to the kind of works that I do, but there isn't. It's just not, and it's not really until they see the process, or until they look up really close. And often the solid areas that I make, they'll be made not out of straight rows, but out of rows of buttonhole stitch that kind of move around the figure, which you can't replicate with fabric or any kind of applique. So I think, yeah, they always, really warrant a closer look.
Well, that was my next question, actually, because
Mhm.
I saw you, so you were doing t-shirt, like tank top and shorts, and basically you could see the lines of the body and how the v-neck of the back of the tank top, like really directional. You could see like where stitches sort of bend around the body. Are you a great artist? Like, do you sketch everything first? Do you plan that? Do you study
I
human
do.
anatomy?
I'm a good drawer. I'm quite a decent drawer. And yeah, that came from, I studied art way back when, and it's always just been a knack. And so in the way that I make figures, and I often make figures, my work involves a lot of self-portraiture. And I see rows of stitches like I would see a pencil mark, like shading, basically. So the kind of looseness of your stitches, of your lines in a shaded work, I sort of see them as the way the buttonhole moves around. I remember an art class years ago, I must have been in high school, I think, and we had to, what were we doing? I think we were drawing maps. It was like a little map of Australia, and we had to colour in the ocean. This kind of been high school. This sounds very primary school now that I'm talking about it. I must have been like, I don't know, like 11, 12. And we were colouring in the ocean. And I remember being told that you couldn't, if you're colouring in an ocean, you never just sort of go back and forth. You're never working in straight rows. Nothing in the natural world just works in that kind of straight rows. You have to move your pencil around and move all of your lines around to make something that looks natural. And I think that stayed with me for a really long time. And I remember this, in life drawing classes at art school, you're always moving your pencil around a form. And so, yeah, in a much slower and more meticulous way, that's how I see my rows. They move around the form, and you can create a sort of three-dimensional shape without it actually being three-dimensional, without changing color, without changing anything, just by the way that you build your rows up.
Well, you also teach lace. You do classes on like the basics of needle lace and more advanced needle lace. So when you teach, like, do people have to be artists to do needle lace, or like do you explain how to approach it?
No, that's just my approach to it. That's more designy. Part of what I love about needle lace, I'm really proud of having taught it. I've been teaching for a year now, and it's this thing that I found a few years, it would have been 7 years ago, I think I first started. And it was such a tiny, tiny little niche, and trying to find any, tutorials on the internet or books or anything like that was really, really difficult. But something I could just see the potential in this, like the scope, and see all of the practitioners kind of dwindling down to this tiny handful of people who could do it. That it was really, I felt a little bit kind of lonely when I first started out, being young and trying to find other needle lace makers and find any kind of community to make this happen. But it was so exactly what I knew I wanted to do. And so having started teaching it, what I've been really happy to see is that the amazing range of different kind of people who are attracted to needle lace. And I mean, I think, I get a lot of textile artists, but also people who just want to stretch their skills, or their needle skills, or they've got, a particular project in mind that they really want to have some kind of lace for, or Like it's, yeah, it doesn't seem to be just artists. It seems to just be, you know, people from all different kinds of backgrounds.
Right. Well, if
Yeah.
somebody doesn't know what needle lace is and like never seen the example of it, how is it different from embroidery? Like, where does the difference stand?
So a couple of things. So needle lace, it's kind of, you've got the umbrella of lace making and you've got the umbrella of embroidery, and needle lace sits right in the middle. So you're, in terms of lace making, a piece of lace is basically any kind of decorative open work fabric. This is, I'm poaching this definition from my friend Rosemary Shepherd here. Any kind of decorative open work fabric where the positive spaces are just as important as the negative spaces. So in terms of design, the holes are as important as the fabric itself. Then you've got embroidery, which I don't have an exact definition for, but often it will be sort of embellishing a piece of fabric or something that's there with stitches, with a needle and thread. And then with needle lace, it's with this particular kind of needle lace, of course, you've got your cut work, which is more embroidery. So that's, you know, using a piece of fabric and building it all up. You know, you can cut holes out and then turn it into lace. But pure needle lace, like just made out of a needle and thread, there is no existing fabric. So it's built up out of just a needle and thread. So you're both creating your fabric and the lace part of it at the same time. It's a process of knotting as well as stitching. And yeah, so it sort of sits in this realm that it sits alone, I think, in its own little definition.
Well, what I loved about your specific pieces, it was like very contemporary in a sense, because it was like going on Instagram and seeing somebody's bunch of selfies of doing everyday sort of moments, like bunch of clothes thrown around, or you peering into the refrigerator and saying, not hungry, just bored.
Yep.
Or you're napping during the COVID. It's like there's like a bunch of self-portraits, all these things. How did you decide on what you're gonna make? Like, how did you come up with that idea?
On the imagery, well, it sort of started, there's this piece, there's a piece of lace here in Sydney in the Powerhouse Museum that is, it's a piece of, I don't know exactly what technique it is, but it's needle lace. But it's from England in the mid 1600s, and it shows the story of Judith beheading Holofernes. And it's about this big, and so tiny and so beautiful, and it's really beautiful and intricate, and it's got all of these sort of filigrees around the edge, but in the middle it shows this horrific story. It's Judith and her servant, and she's holding the head of Holofernes and a sword in the other hand, and his, you know, his body is there bleeding out, and it's like, this is made out of a piece of lace. Like, this is such an incredibly violent and horrible thing to show in something that is so beautiful. And basically seeing that piece just had me ricocheting off into doing my own kind of pictorial needle lace. And so that kind of, I was looking at a lot of other figurative needle lace pieces, and a lot of them were, you know, they're such grand stories. They're all massive Bible tales, and they're stories of the ends of different wars and coronations of different kings. And that's so not my life, you know. I've got such a lovely, ordinary life in, you know, just being a millennial in Sydney. And I was like, well, I'll just make my own dumb stories, little, you know, that kind of precious commemoration of the little things that happened to my life. And then put them through this process of fine stitching and fine detail, and the meditative state that you get into when you're stitching, it sort of makes all of those tiny moments a little bit more magical, a little bit more precious.
When you published it on Instagram, when you posted those, like the first few pieces, right? How was it received? Were people just blown away by your creativity? Were they asking like, why on earth you spending all this time doing it? Like, what was the reception?
It was overwhelmingly positive. I do occasionally have people who tell me I've got too much time on my hands, which, you know,
I get that
screw
all the
it.
time.
Everyone gets right.
I know.
That.
I have like my classmates who, like, you know, 30 years later, they're like, you know, I wish I had time on my hands like this.
Yeah. And you're like, you know what? I don't. I'm spending 6 months working on a tiny little piece of lace. Like, where do you think my time is? It's busy, and I'm doing it on, you know, spending it on something really important. Yeah, so I do get that sometimes. But overwhelmingly, it's been really positive. I think that there is a recognition of, you know, first of all, the need to keep these techniques alive. There really are, you know, I brush it off a lot, but there are very few practitioners that actually make needle lace regularly, and even fewer of them who can use the internet. And so it's sort of, or with any kind of, you know, internet literacy. And so, yeah, there is sort of imperative there, and I think a lot of people recognize that. And then, yeah, there's just something that one of the things that I find is that the more specific you make your stories, the more weirdly universal they end up. Like, they hit a little bit harder, I think, you know. If it's just making something beautiful or just making something kind of generic, you can hit an audience, but when you tell something truthful about your own life, something very small and very truthful, it often means that people will respond in a more real and more heartfelt way, I think. And you know, a lot of my work comes from places that I'm not the most happy with or content. You know, I spend a lot of, you know, those COVID self-portraits were me coping with losing my job and being terrified and, you know, lockdown, and you know, they're not necessarily all coming from the most joyous moments. And I think having sort of created them all and then shared them, you get this sense of connection with your audience as well. And I think, yeah, people can sort of appreciate that, which has been really nice. It's a good connection.
Well, when I looked at your self-portraits, and the majority of them is in nude, like, why did you decide to go nude, first of all? And secondly, like, it's not the image of contemporary perfect model female body, right? Like, it's more of a, like, what we all probably look like, but not what the world wants us to look like. Why did you decide to go that way? Why did you decide to do those portraits in nude? And why did you decide not to perfect them, to make them look more like Barbie, let's say?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the nudity is just like, well, if I'm being honest about myself, I might as well be honest about my body too. And I like the way they look. I like my curves. I'm very, you know, I've always been very happy with, you know, being curvy and all of that. I think, I don't know, I'm like, I look great, whatever. It doesn't matter. And so, yeah, I don't really have any interest in, particularly because here I am showing stories that are, you know, not the necessarily, well, sometimes they are. I am also telling stories about lovely, you know, small moments of joy. But, you know, if you're being honest about your life, you're going to be honest about your body as well. And I don't want to idealize myself. I think, yeah, those are the bits of kind of real life that I want to show. And also, I mean, part of this, I guess this kind of comes back to drawing and having done so many life drawing classes back, you know, from when I was a teenager. I was going and doing life drawing classes, and there is something about about the way that you can create flesh just with moving those lines around. And I am really curious about that. You know, I often, weirdly, now that I think about it, I often make figures like myself in the nude, but then clothes on the ground, which I had never really drawn that line in between my works before. But so I love when you're making things like clothes or blankets or drapery. I love to be able to work on those in different stitches as well, kind of move them around. And then the difference between making skin out of, say, a really tight kind of buttonhole stitch and then making fabric out of some other kind of stitch, that's often, yeah, part of the craft of it for me, is trying to make these things look as realistic as I can in lace. So,
well, when you look at your work, do you compare it with like historical lace that exist in museums, or are you a pioneer in the field and you're trying to create new textures, new feels, new looks?
oh, I always try to link it back to something historical. I do definitely see myself as sitting within a continuum of lace makers. I don't want to be alone in this field, and which is why I'm very happy to be sharing the skills and teaching them. I want there to be as many needle lace makers as possible. And yeah, I do. I mean, there are a couple of techniques that I have either seen historically, but sort of tried to replicate and then kind of moved on. So there are a few stitches that I recognize as entirely my own. But for the most part, no, I am using historical techniques. I've got this beautiful, this is one of my favorite books, this History of Needlework. And I've got, yeah, there's a long sort of section about needle made laces in here that I often sort of refer back to, and they've got lots of really interesting tutorials in there. But yeah, that's from like 1909 or something. So you've really got to dig in there.
Well, when you look at your early work and compare it with where you're now, how did it change? Like, what did you learn in those 7 years?
Early works, I just got better. Just got heaps better at it. And more intricate. When I switched to, there's a work that I made, I think 2017, where I think you mentioned it before, it's the one where I'm staring into the fridge. So it's a self-portrait. I'm there in my underwear and a t-shirt, and I'm just staring into the fridge, and I've called it Not Hungry, Just Bored. And that was, from this time I was again unemployed, and just, it was the heat of an Australian summer, and just one of those times where you're just sort of doing nothing, just rearranging a couple of words on your resume, and then just occasionally staring into the fridge. And that was the piece that I first made out of silk. So I found this really beautiful silk thread. And it was also the piece where I did the most solid stitching. So I made the entire fridge solid out of buttonhole stitch. So, one side of that fridge, I like to say, because it is true, but it's a very dumb story, but one side of the fridge took a whole season of the Gilmore Girls. I just had that on in the background, and then just, just did a side of a fridge for a whole season. And I think that one was a bit of a turning point for me, because of that intricacy. Everything else that I had done was quite, now that I sort of look back on it, it all had sort of thicker thread, and it was a bit more stilted. Whereas I think this one, I really went into the intricacy of it. And then after that, I moved into doing a couple of colors every now and then. Well, not like colors. I do like to stick with a sort of, a really subtle kind of palette. But yeah, I think just my nature as a craft person wants to try something new for each one. So they do develop in interesting ways each time, I think.
Well, talking about the shows that you watch, some of the videos that you post on Instagram have the background track from whatever show you're watching. Like there's
like Monk or something.
And why would you leave it there? Why not put music? Like, what's your thinking behind it?
there's no point in making it pretty, you know. It's like yeah, I think the reality of it is so much more interesting, you know, knowing that these things came from a messy studio with Grace and Frankie playing in the background, or I think that it's also more accessible, you know. If my goal is to get lots of people interested in needle lace and making needle lace and recognizing it and acknowledging it as an art form, I think it's easier to do that from a place of relatability and honesty, rather than going, you know, I was listening to Puccini in the background, which I do. I listen to Puccini. I love Puccini, but like, yeah, it's a sort of yeah, it feels more relatable. It feels more real if it's like, well, you know, I was watching my 7th episode of Monk in a row while I was picking these little threads out.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
What is your goal? Like, do you have a goal? Do you think about that? Do you see like yourself as a preservation of certain fiber art, and your goal is like to carry the knowledge, like, you know, the torch to the next generation? Like, do you give it a thought?
I don't really, I'm not a planner, generally speaking. But I have, like, the more, when I do think about it, and think about, you know, this year of having taught, you know, I think so far I've had just over 100 students in the last year take on in sort of some kind of basic introductory course, and that just, it had never really been my goal to teach, but since I have, it's made me so happy. Like, it's if I do have a goal to teach it and to preserve these, that's something that's still growing, and I'm still working it out, I think. Like, I don't, you know, I'm not someone who has like 5-year plans or a visualization board or anything like that. That's not nothing specific. I mean, I wouldn't have even come to lace making necessarily if I'd had a proper plan. This was a total sidetrack. I did a class on a whim 7 years ago, and then allowed it to completely take over my life. So yeah, I don't have, there's no specific goal, but at the moment, the way that I have the joy that I've gotten out of teaching has been, yeah, worthy of just going and going and going. So I'm gonna keep doing that for a long time. But I also, to find some kind of balance of teaching and still creating my own work, because, you know, at the very bottom line, I'm here because I love it. I'm making lace because I can't not. I love doing it. I love the detail. I love learning new things. I love, you know, I just started adding beads to it. That's been another thing, adding some colors, making them 3-dimensional. And so, yeah, a combination of spreading the joy of it and also maintaining a little bit for myself.
Well,
yeah.
I heard that story that like when you first went and you took that class, it was like few hours class, then you quit your job, went to different country and start traveling Europe. Like, do you do, like, was that the first time when you drastically changed your life for fiber arts? And do you like see yourself doing it again in the future?
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, well, yeah, so that was, I mean, it was definitely a drastic change, but, you know, I wasn't like working as a corporate lawyer or anything. I was running a tiny community arts gallery. And so that it was slightly smoother than I think I make it sound sometimes, you know. It's like, so I took a class. I was running, this was after uni. I studied art at uni, but I was in sculpture, and I did a little bit of textiles, but nothing, not very much. Just sort of, I was mostly working in steel and wood, and then I would sort of cover structures with fabric and with thread. And yeah, and then so I was running an art gallery in an old department store. There was like an abandoned department store. It was horrible. I mean, it was lovely. I loved the time, but the room was, you know, we used all of the old the shelving and the paraphernalia from this very recognizable department store in Australia. And it was funny old building that smelled like mold, but like we had this really beautiful little community of all people who were making things in their separate little areas. And then through those guys, I got a little grant to go and take a class somewhere. And then, from that, that was the Australian Lacemakers Guild annual general meeting. Was just, right then. And I never looked back. I just went and was like, well, this is it. This is me for life. I could not love a process more, possibly. It's so detailed, it's so divine. And so I just basically went back, spent a couple of months sorting things out, closed the gallery, moved out of my house, and went traveling. I kind of needed a change anyway. It was time, but it was great. So I went to England, to where was it, Somerset, and learnt Aemilia needle lace from a woman called Doreen Holmes. She runs a needle lace course from her house. And then to Italy, to America for a little while, and then came back and just kept it up.
Well, you mentioned somewhere that you don't sell your lace, right?
Yes, well, I have loosened those parameters a little bit, but no, I'm a bit precious about it. So I have sold a couple. So now that work that I was talking about at the Powerhouse Museum, the Judith and Holofernes piece, I've just sold 2 of my pieces to their collection. So that was a big moment for me, this piece that I have loved, that changed the way that I work.
When you say that you don't plan things, do you dream about things? Do you dream that like one day everything you made is going to be a permanent exhibit in that museum?
Not really. I'm surprisingly detached from I love the works, I love making them, and I don't necessarily see them as what am I trying to say? I don't see their futures. I love them, and I want them to have beautiful homes, but I don't need to have I don't need praise for it. I don't need, whatever. I just want to make them and then have them appreciated by people who appreciate them, so they don't necessarily have to be, I don't need a wing of a gallery, you know what I mean? Like, I love having them exhibited, but the having them seen is not, having them seen by lots of eyes is not something that matters to me. Having them loved by people who I care about, that's what I want. So,
talking about people that you love, so I've heard you have 5 brothers, and one of them had beautiful dance moves, actually, on your Instagram. I was admiring him today.
True.
How was it to grow up with 5 brothers, and how do they look at your work now? Are they like very supportive? Are they surprised that you're doing this?
Oh no, we all went into some very strange worlds, all 6 of us. So yeah, it was very kind of natural. They're great. They're so they're lovely and supportive, and yeah, we're all best friends. They're good characters. But yeah, so our parents are all artists as well, and so we basically just had free reign of what we wanted to do. And yeah, so it was a very boisterous household growing up, very much. So the boys, like our parents were very creative and wanted us to also use our creativity. And so things like the boys all wanted to play with toy guns. And the rule was you can play with as many guns as you like, but you have to make them all yourself. And so we all learnt really interesting kind of processes really early. So we could all do woodworking from a really young age, and we were all learnt to solder and to weld and things like that when we were kids. And so the arsenal that those boys built up was immaculate. There were like 3-way swivel guns. There were just incredibly perfectly carved kind of handles, and it was quite an amazing experience, really. And so it was loud and very creative, and now we've all gone into the arts in some way. So we've got filmmakers, DJs. One of my brothers is a Twitch person, so I think we all really went very niche-y into our own areas, and so it kind of just makes sense that someone else there's a lace maker, there's a DJ, there's a Twitch person. It just seems like a natural thing.
Were you the leader of the gang, or were you like sitting in the corner and doing your fine arts?
I was sitting in the corner, but also the boss. I did not play with the guns, but that everyone sort of, listened to me. That's I would say still the case.
Does it help you with your teaching career, like that you know how to get the attention of the audience?
I never thought of that. Yeah, probably. Yeah, can always. I think any kind of experience of being in the middle of a very loud, very boisterous kind of group helps you in the future. I'm very grateful to have been part of a pack for such a long time as a kid. I think it's a lovely thing to have known and have grown up with.
Well, when you say, like, now you mentioned that you want to incorporate beads into your lace work, have you ever thought about combining your initial passion for sculpture with the lace?
Definitely. I'm working on a series of 3D ones as we speak. Yep, that's coming. It's still in very early phases, but that's been something that has been on the cards for a long time, and I've finally got to the point where I'm like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. So yes, big old yes to that question.
That book that you showed me is like, do you have a fantasy of writing your own and adding to that library of knowledge?
Yeah, that is also on the cards. So I've sort of got a few bits that I've started writing, that hopefully I'll start turning into something. I'm thinking next year, which obviously any kind of writing or book project takes years and years, but yes, I definitely want to do that. I love writing and I love words, and so that's going to happen as well.
Well, you mentioned that like 1 square centimeter takes a day or something. Like, I can't even remember how many days.
About an hour, yeah.
An hour.
Sometimes a day.
Do you have like any ambition to create a really large piece of lace, because you always do like smaller ones? So
yeah, not a large. I would have an ambition. I think I just love small scale. If anyone else wants to learn it and take over and work in large materials, I absolutely encourage that, but I'm such a tiny detail person. My version of a large scale work would be lots and lots of repetition of a small scale work. And so I do definitely have a vision of being able to, I'm currently working now on, I've got enough works to kind of fill a small wall, but I would love to be able to fill a kind of larger space, just to be able to see what that's like. Which goes right back to, contradict myself what I was saying about not exhibiting in galleries. But I do want to have a look at what it's like to see a lot of these works all together. So I'll still try that.
I mean, so when I started knitting, or when anybody starts knitting, it's usually like thicker needles, thicker yarn. Now, like my ultimate high is to see how thin of a thread I can work with and how thin of needles I can work. Is it the same thing for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, I'm working with the finest thread I can, and all I want to do now is get something even finer. Like, it's such a compulsion.
It's like Olympic sport in
It's
fiber
such
art.
an Olympic sport. Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's such a, and it's nice hearing other people talk about it, because it's such a compulsion, you know. It's and I often get that about adding other layers to needle lace too. You know, you can make sort of a base layer and then embellish it and embellish it and embellish it, and so that kind of adding detail to detail to detail is the kind of thing. If I can't get a finer thread, at least I can make it 17 times more complicated. You know.
So how do you know when to stop? Like, do you have hard time stopping yourself from playing with it more and more and more?
Yeah, I do. I have a really hard time stopping myself. But there's a point where you know, like, there's a couple that I think I still haven't finished that I've kind of taken off the backing. One of the things about needle lace is that there is a natural finishing point when you you build it up on a backing. So you've got a piece of fabric and then your pattern and then some kind of protective layer, and then everything is built up just out of your stitches and your knots and your everything on a needle and thread on top of that backing. And then when you finally cut that off, that's basically the end of the process. So once you've done that, there's not a huge amount you can do except come back and embroider on top. And so by that time, usually everything's filled out. I've got tons of detail, and aside from a tiny bit of embroidery, there's nothing I can do. So it does kind of naturally stop myself and stop me from getting too involved. But yeah, I do. You know, I also appreciate space within my work, particularly as a lace maker. You need areas to kind of breathe, and so I think that I am still fairly good at knowing not to add too much to particular places, so that your eye has sort of a rest.
Well, you know how, like, sometimes, let's say you watch Grace and Frankie and there is like 17 seasons and 200 episodes each season. So at some point you find yourself like living in the show, or the same thing happens when you have like a really good book and you read it and you sort of like find yourself living in the book, right?
Yeah.
And then when you stop that book or you stop the show, you're mentally still there. It's hard for you to like move on and like immediately start watching something else or read something else, because your thoughts are still there. Does that happen to you with your work? Like, how
Oh yeah,
easy it is for you to like move to the next project?
Yeah, I usually describe it as falling in love. Like, I really fall in love with each one. And I think it's sort of, you would naturally assume that after all of this time, you just want to get it away from you, like, oh, it's done and it's over. But I still, you know, after all of this, like, when I'm making it, I sneak away from, you know, like, I'll cancel parties or sneak away or whatever, just to spend some time with the work to make it. And so I really am in deep towards the end. You know, I just can't stop. I'll spend sort of 8 hours just sitting and stitching, you know, this one final line. And then I just put it up and I just can't stop looking at it for a really long time. Like, I just see every stitch and see all of the moments that I that went into it. But then it does naturally, for whatever reason, you know, and I'm very lucky that my process has worked like this so far. What happens then is that my sort of thoughts will move on and will be excited about the next thing.
Does that happen like after you're done with the work, or does that ever happen while you're doing the work? Like, does your mind wander to the next thing already?
No, weirdly, never does. It always happens after I'm done. I'm too obsessed with the ones that I'm doing to move on. So I mean, I don't know, maybe it will eventually happen. Maybe I'll stop enjoying one while I'm making it, and I'm, you know, open to that idea. That's one of the reasons why I have been so I guess, kind of strict up until now about not selling my works too much, because I don't ever want to get it to a point where I can't waste 6 months on something that I don't finish. You know, if I want to be able to, yeah, I don't want the pressure of having to pay for my life to rest on the shoulders of lace making because it is so slow, and I want it to be able to breathe and to be able, I want to be able to fail regularly. I like the idea that I'm going to make some things that don't work, and that I can give it the room to do that. I could waste 6 months and that's fine, you know.
Well, let's talk about those failures. Like, what do you consider failing?
I could probably pick a better word than failure, I guess. But there are a couple of works that I have finished and have exhibited and didn't feel quite right about. Like, you know, it's like I didn't quite get the design right, or and those were often worked to a deadline. So yeah, you know, just didn't quite kind of get there. But yeah, ordinarily speaking, you know, and I don't, you know, if I end up abandoning a project, I would say that that's some kind of failure. But at the same time, you're going to learn something from it. You know, you're going to, like, one of the works that I finished but was not very happy with, I had a lot of there were two things that I learned from it. Part one was that I didn't draw the figures from life. Like, I made them up in my head, and I'm just not as good at that as I am at drawing what's in front of me. You know, I'm much better at observational drawing than I am at other stuff. And so there wasn't the life in it that I go for in my work. And the other thing was just one of those funny little design things that you end up learning after a long time doing lace making, which is that if you're making a figure and you have too many limbs that cross over, it's way too confusing. And I wouldn't have learned that if I hadn't spent, you know, months creating this work that I don't like. So
You usually work on one project always at the time, or are there multiple projects that go parallel to each other?
Nah, one at a time, always one at a time for me. Yeah, it just is the way that I work because I'm so deeply invested in each one. Yeah, I can't move on. And every now and then I'll be kind of forced because of an exhibition or because of, you know, some other project to have to do simultaneous pieces, and it does not suit me. Oh my gosh, it doesn't suit me. So
when you're doing exhibitions, how does it feel to stand there and like see people's reaction to your work?
It's I mean, I've been exhibiting for a long time, and it's tricky. It's a hard thing to do, to stand in front of something that you've made and just be there talking about it. I mean, obviously it's wonderful. It is a wonderful thing to have someone come up to you and tell you that they have been moved by your work. That is, like, I would bottle that feeling and drink it if it comes from this kind of real, beautiful place. And so often it does. You know, I'll have exhibit something somewhere and can see it really touch someone, and that is an incredible feeling, like that sort of individual one-on-one thing. But I think sometimes I do struggle with particularly at sort of big gallery openings and things, because they're so tiny and so precious. You know, if you're sort of talking to tons of people all at once and trying to sort of, I mean, maybe I'm just talking about being socially awkward. I think maybe this is not related at all to general lace making. But yeah, it can be difficult, particularly with a technique like this, where it's not, you know, like you were saying at the beginning, often people will see it and assume that it's sort of an applique process, or you know, some other kind of textile. And so if you're talking all at once to a lot of people, and you not only have to say, you know, things about the imagery, but also try to explain all of the process of making this work, talk about all the time that went into it, talk about your materials. I think that is something that's specific with textile artists. It's not, if you've done a series of paintings and you put them on the wall, you're fielding questions about the paintings themselves, about what you've chosen to depict, or what, you know, the kind of the color, the texture, the whatever. You're not having to explain what a painting is. You know what I mean? Whereas with a lot of different textiles, particularly if you're working in something that's so specific and nichey like this, you're not just talking about the work itself, you're talking about the entire history of lace making. Where does this sit? Where does, you know, whatever. And I do occasionally get overwhelmed by the variety of things people want to know, if you're standing there and talking to 50 people at once.
Do you feel like it's your function to be that expert that knows everything about the lace, to be able to explain people the whole like history of it, what other artists that doing it? Like, do you feel like you must know all of that?
No, well, no, now that you say it like that, of course I don't. But you know, if someone asks you a question, you want to answer it as best you can. And this was something, you know, I've talked to a lot of people who have worked in kind of across lots of different mediums, and this, I think, is something quite specific to textiles, that that when you work in a textile medium of any kind, the conversation really does hone, like it just absolutely goes into, how did you make that? How did that all get done? And I love talking about that. I love answering all of those questions, but sometimes it's difficult in a sort of art context. You know, I'm kind of trying to straddle these worlds of crafting and art, I suppose. And I've really kind of veered right into craft world. And so when I dip my toe back into art waters, it's like, oh, it's a whole different series of questions and of things that you've got to talk about, things that you have to remind people, or to tell people. And I don't resent that. You know, I'm very happy to be sort of part of that in the art world, and I'm very happy to be the sort of conduit for lace making infiltrating its way into the, well, at least the, you know, Australian, New South Wales
well,
art scene.
I recently interviewed another Australian fiber artist, Michelle from Threefold Design, and she does the tapestry. And what I find similar about you and her, because it's both of those things, the needle lace and tapestry, go back into the, you know, centuries, and every museum you can find it. And I also find that, like, you putting your process on the Instagram, and she explains her process and puts videos of how she does it, like step by step kind of sort of thing. When I interviewed her, one of the things she said, that she thinks every artist should have a YouTube channel to show their process and to just spread that knowledge. Do you plan to ever have your own YouTube channel with all your tutorials?
I hadn't thought of an actual YouTube channel. Like I've done, now that I'm teaching and I'm doing a lot of these kind of online teaching courses, I have actually, you know, I've been filming myself and working it all out. But yeah, those have been for these like very specific audiences, you know, for my particular students. A YouTube channel, yeah, maybe, I don't know. It's not necessarily, you know, speaking of future and dreams and everything, it's I haven't necessarily thought of doing a YouTube channel, yeah, but since I've been doing yeah, those process videos on Instagram, those have gone, yeah, they've had a really good reception. You know, I have really appreciated the way that people respond to seeing the process. And that, you know, this is why I don't mind, even in an art context, I don't mind answering questions about the process, because it is fascinating. I know that it's fascinating. That's why I'm here. So yeah, maybe some kind of YouTube channel, that'd be fun.
Totally. See you doing that. That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, what's your relationship with social media? How much time do you spend on Instagram? How much do you stress over what you're gonna post?
Yeah, I mean, I would be nowhere without Instagram. I well, not nowhere. Still be making lace and loving it, but yeah, it's definitely that kind of you know, like Instagram, the way that Instagram is, and the way that it's so you know, quick, and the language of you know, fast-paced memes and things like that has really influenced the kind of imagery that I choose to do. You know, I love the juxtaposition between you know, meme culture and old school lace making. I think that's really, I love that this thing exists, and on Instagram, you know, there's a community of really interesting lace makers. I've been in contact with all these people all around the world, and yeah, it's been incredible. So yeah, it's definitely a big part of my my practice these days. And yeah, I suppose, you know, I like to have nice photos that I put up, but I'm not necessarily, you know, I don't know, I don't post at particular times of day, and I'm not, it's interesting when you get a little algorithmic boost. But yeah, I'm not very good at, you know, I'm not a planner. That's been very much established. So I don't know. It's all just happy, you know, flukes when posts go really well. And I love sharing the works and sharing the process with people.
Well, okay,
but I'm not very strategic about it.
But then there are some videos of like just like sort of funny, silly kind of thing. Again, back to your brother dancing. Not that it was silly, it was very artistic.
Yeah.
But like, how do you decide what you're gonna post?
I think it's an interesting kind of thing, Instagram, isn't it? Because it's a combination between showing your work and showing your life. And you know, my because my work is sort of confessional. Is confessional a good word for it? Like that kind of, here's a couple of honest moments from my own life. I think Instagram is sort of part of that. That's what you do, is you share. I mean, it's curated to an extent as well, right? Like I'm not, you know, entirely warts and all. But it does, it's your sort of way of putting yourself across to the world. And so Instagram for me is doing that both with my work and with my own life. You know, I think I've been posting less just about my everyday life lately. I mean, it comes up every now and then. I don't have a separate life and work account. And so, you know, that's just kind of a part of it. It's all one funny kind of mashup. It's like, here's a workshop. Also, you know, here's Ollie doing a weird dance. Also, here's, I think that's kind of part of it. It's like, here is all of me, you know, and work and life and everything. Yeah, it's all.
Well, do you think like when people look at your Instagram, they feel like they know you? And if like you wanted them to know one thing about you, what would that be?
Ooh, that's tricky. I think that I just would always want to impress upon the people who are looking at my work the joy that I get out of it, and that is the reason why I'm here, and that's the reason why anyone should be here. No one should take up lace making if they don't love it, because it's not going to, you know, lead to enormous financial success. It's not going to, you know, you're not going to start a massive industry. You should just be here because you love it. And so far, everyone who I've interacted with, all my students who have sort of stuck with me, are here because they love it.
Like if one of your students or somebody new to lace would ask you for advice of how to approach lace, what would be your advice? Like, what's the most important quality the person must have to be able to enjoy lace and do it successfully?
Patience. Just patience and obsession. It really does. This kind of technique really does call for someone who just can't stop, just wants to keep going and going and going. Yeah, if you're someone who likes really speedy things to just sort of be done and over with, then yeah, lace making will not be for you. Yeah, so I think that's what you're going to want, is you, and I think it's kind of a self-selecting audience. I think a lot of people who are drawn to works that are very detail based and very intricate, I think the people who love those works are often the people who love detail in themselves, who love the way that it sort of is created, and who would dedicate a bunch of time to that kind of process. So yeah, you know, I haven't had any students that just sort of are that impatient, that just want to speed it up. But I'd say, yeah, that's sort of your that's the bar you've got to clear: patience and obsession.
Well, I'll ask you a question that I recently asked a few people. If an archaeologist found one of your pieces, like 1,000 years from now, which one would you want them to find and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay. I think I've got two works that I made in a sort of in a sort of set together that I kind of consider one work now, and they need a little bit of brushing up. You know, the frames have kind of bent a little bit and stuff like that. I do have to go back to that in the studio and before I exhibit them again. But it was the first time that I think I went. I did a lot of kind of storytelling in them. It was about, you know, I was 27 and I was, you know, just kind of happily living and working a fun day job and looking after my chickens. And, you know, it was just a nice time. And I sort of made this work about like, oh, I'm just okay all the time. It was, you know, just a little nude selfie in the mirror, feeling fine. And you know, lots of books and wine, having lots of wine with my friends. It was like a really lovely time. And then shortly afterwards, nothing had really changed, but I just was miserable all of a sudden. And I think we all go through those periods where it's like, oh, this sort of quiet joy that I was experiencing isn't reaching me anymore. It's not there, even though nothing has changed. And you know, the way that I sort of dealt with that in my real life was, you know, a bit of ridiculous late 20s dumb self-sacrificing kind of nonsense, you know. You know, having too much coffee, sort of getting a bit too flirty or whatever, you know, having sex with strangers, or really just self-sabotaging stuff. And so yeah, and so I sort of made a piece that went next to it to show all of that stuff that I was doing, to kind of indicate that I was not as okay as I was, you know, a year ago. Showing that too much coffee, showing that self-sabotaging sex, showing, you know, the weird obsession I had with crosswords at the time, and just saying, you know, I'm not as good as I was before. I don't know what's happened. And then showing those two pieces next to each other, I have felt like that's been a real, that was a big turning point for me, was to be that honest about my own life and to just put it on a wall. And so I think that those two pieces, if an archaeologist was to come down and find something, I'd like them to see those, because they're the biggest and most honest ways that I've expressed myself, I think, so far in my work.
Well, I mean, I really love watching your videos, your pictures, your working on Instagram. I do hope you're gonna start that YouTube channel so we can learn from you.
Thank you.
Provide the audience that we can learn from you. And I think you're doing a wonderful job of keeping this technique alive and bringing it to masses and spreading the word about it. And
thank you so much. Thank you.
I really loved having you as a guest of my channel. I really enjoyed our chat. And I
My
learned
pleasure.
some new technique that I'm actually very tempted to try because I am obsessed with different lace making. So I'm thinking like that might be something I'll try in the future.
Fantastic. Hit me up. I'll help you out.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Maggie. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. Thank you.